Rain hammered the cathedral glass like it had a grievance. It fell in sheets, violent and relentless, and the sound of it filled the vaulted ceiling the way organ music was supposed to, loud, unavoidable, pressing down on everything beneath it. The guests seated in their ivory-draped rows did not look at the rain. They looked at him. Kang Jihoon stood at the altar in a pale ivory suit and white silk gloves, and he looked like something the storm had carved and left standing. Still. Unbothered. Breathtakingly composed in the way that made people uncomfortable, not because there was anything wrong with him, but because there was nothing visibly broken, and they had expected broken. A blind, mute Omega marrying into the most powerful Alpha family in Seoul's underworld, and he stood there as though the entire ceremony was simply whether he had decided to wait out. His gloved fingers held a ring box he could not open himself. He did not need to see it. He had learned, in the years since darkness took him, that the world leaves enough behind for those willing to listen. The weight of a footstep tells you who is nervous. The rhythm of a breath tells you who is lying. The temperature of a room tells you everything the faces in it are trying to hide. And tonight, the temperature was wrong. Before we start, make sure to hit like and subscribe to Boys Love, and really I'm curious, where are you watching from? Drop your country name in the comments. I love seeing how far our love stories travel. The Kang triplets stood around him in a formation the world called love. Kang Ryan to his left, the obsessive one, whose breathing always came half a count too fast when Jihoon was within arm's reach. Kang Seojun to his right, the cold one, whose footsteps were always measured, always deliberate, always somehow the quietest in a room full of dangerous men. Kang Daehoon directly behind him, the playful one, whose cologne was expensive and whose silence, on the rare occasions he chose it, was the most dangerous thing about him. 3 faces carved from the same stone. 3 men who had surrounded Jihoon for years with something the guests mistook for devotion. Jihoon had called it safety. He was beginning to reconsider. Ryan leaned close. His lips came to the edge of Jihoon's ear with the practiced intimacy of a man who had been doing it for years. And he whispered 4 words so quiet that even the rain could not compete with the cold precision of them landing directly against Jihoon's skin. You were never supposed to survive long enough to marry us. Every nerve in Jihoon's body locked. Then, from somewhere deep in the cathedral's shadow, from a place no invited guest was standing, came a sound that did not belong to the ceremony. A low, unhurried laugh. Composed. Dangerous. The laugh of a man who found the entire room amusing in a way he had not bothered to conceal. And then a voice. Quiet enough to be a secret. Certain enough to be a verdict. Interesting. The triplets still don't know who he really is. The cathedral went cold. Not the temperature, the feeling. That specific drop that happens when something shifts in a room and everyone present understands, without being able to name it, that the moment they are standing inside has just become something entirely different from what it was a second ago. This story begins 6 months before Jihoon understood what love had been hiding from him. 6 months before the altar, the estate was quiet in the way expensive things are quiet, deliberately, carefully, at great cost. The Kang family compound in northern Seoul sat behind walls thick enough to stop sound, and most nights, it succeeded. Most nights, Jihoon moved through its corridors the way he moved through everything, precisely, patiently, memorizing the world one texture and temperature at a time. He noticed the cologne first. It was Ryan's, a particular cedar and black pepper blend that cost more per bottle than most people spent on rent. Jihoon knew it the way he knew all 3 of them, by composition, not by choice. He had catalogued every detail of the men he loved out of necessity, and over years that catalogue had become something uncomfortably close to a surveillance system. He had never intended it that way. It had simply become true. The cologne disappeared every Thursday evening at 7. Gone for 3 hours. Gone cleanly, no trail, no overlap, no chemical ghost on the jacket when it returned. Which meant Ryan was not going to a restaurant, not to a cigar bar, not anywhere that left evidence on fabric. He was going somewhere clinical. Controlled. Somewhere with filtered air. Seojeon's footsteps followed the same Thursday pattern within 20 minutes. Then Jihoon's. 3 separate departures with the careful spacing of men who believed no one was counting. Jihoon was counting. He told himself it was business for 5 Thursdays in a row. The Kong Empire ran operations he was not privy to and had never asked about. Trust was a choice. He had made it once and intended to keep it. He folded his suspicion into the back of his chest like a letter he was not ready to open. On the 6th Thursday he opened it. He followed Jihoon's Cologne trail 2 blocks east of the estate to a private medical facility, small, unmarked, the kind of building that existed specifically to treat people who could not afford to be on record. Jihoon moved along the outer corridor wall with one hand brushing the plaster, counting doorways, listening past the ventilation hung to the room at the end of the hall where 3 voices gathered behind a closed door. A surgeon's voice, measured and dry, discussing recovery timelines. Then Ryan's voice, tighter than Jihoon had ever heard it, stripped of the controlling warmth it usually performed. Then Seojeon, very quiet. Then Jihoon, asking a question that the surgeon answered with the kind of careful precision that people use when the answer is not good news. Jihoon pressed his hand flat against the cold wall outside that door. And then Ryan said it. Not to Jihoon. Not knowing Jihoon was there. He said it to his brothers in the voice of a man who had been carrying something too heavy for too long. If he remembers that night, the real night, he'll hate us forever. The corridor did not move. The ventilation kept humming. Somewhere down the hall a door opened and closed, and the sound meant nothing. Jihoon stood very still and understood, with a clarity that bypassed grief entirely and arrived directly at something colder, that the men he loved were not hiding a person from him. They were hiding a memory. His memory. And they were terrified of the moment it came back. He did not go through the door. He did not make a sound. He turned around in the dark the way he had learned to turn around in every dark room, carefully, deliberately, without leaving a trace that he had ever been there at all. He had learned that skill by necessity. He used it now for the first time as a weapon. The dinner that broke everything open was not supposed to be violent. It was a negotiation, 3 rival families, 2 neutral parties, 1 table and a private room above a Gangnam restaurant that did not exist on any public booking platform. Jihoon had attended a dozen of these evenings over the years. He sat where he was placed, read the room through its sounds, and performed the role assigned to him, beautiful, silent, unthreatening. The Kangs brought him to these events the way powerful men bring certain objects, not for function, but for the message. He had never minded. He had told himself he did not mind. That night, the negotiation fractured somewhere between the second and third course. Jihoon heard it before anyone moved, a specific shift in the air pressure of the room, the kind that comes right before someone decides a conversation is over. Glass broke. A chair went back hard against the floor. Then voices, overlapping, and the controlled chaos of men with security training responding to a situation that had stopped being controlled. In the movement and the noise and the rearrangement of bodies through a room suddenly full of urgency, nobody noticed one small, still figure standing up from his chair and walking, not toward the exit everyone else was rushing for, but away from it. Through the service corridor. Down a staircase that smelled of kitchen steam and cold concrete. Out a door that opened onto a side street running parallel to the Han River. No coat. No guide. No note. The rain was already falling when Jihoon stepped outside, and he walked into it without slowing down. He had memorized 4 kilometers of Seoul over years of careful, incremental study, each block logged by sound, by texture underfoot, by the particular smell of each intersection. He walked the way birds navigate, not by landmarks, but by something interior and precise that required no light to function. His legs gave out on the bridge. Not dramatically. They simply stopped cooperating, the accumulated weight of years and one very long evening arriving at once, and Jihoon sat down on the wet pavement with his back against the railing and his face turned toward the rain. The Han River moved below him in a sound that was both enormous and indifferent. He sat there because there was nowhere else to go, and because going somewhere else would have required knowing what came next, and he did not know that yet. The car arrived without headlights. He heard the engine first, a particular low-frequency hum that belonged to a vehicle built for silence. Then footsteps, unhurried and even, moving through rain without the hesitation of someone unused to bad weather. Then the shift in air as a large presence lowered itself to his level, not standing over him, but crouching, coming down to exactly where he was. No hands reached out. No arm extended to lift him. The presence simply settled, and stayed, and waited. And then the voice came, quiet enough to belong to the rain, certain enough to belong to nothing but itself. "Tell me, did they finally realize you were never their victim?" Jihoon turned his face toward the sound. His body stilled in a way it had not been still all night. Because underneath the calm of that voice, underneath the precision and the quiet authority and the particular quality of danger that some men carry so naturally it becomes indistinguishable from their breathing, he heard something else. Something his body recognized before his mind caught up. A heartbeat. He knew this heartbeat. He had catalogued thousands over years of careful, involuntary study, and he knew this one. He had heard it once before, close, very close, closer than a stranger should have been, on the worst night of his life, in the seconds before the world went dark. A heartbeat that had been near enough to touch. A heartbeat that, unlike everything else from that night, had not run. Jihoon reached out one white-gloved hand into the rain between them. Park Siwon, the most dangerous man in Seoul, the name the underworld spoke with the same quiet dread reserved for forces of nature, looked at that hand for one long moment. And then he took it. With both of his. Carefully. Like something he had been afraid of damaging for a very long time. The triplets were already calling his name into an empty room on the other side of the city. But Jihoon could no longer hear them over the sound of a heartbeat he had never forgotten. Park Siwon's residence was the opposite of the Kong estate in every way that mattered. The Kong compound announced itself: high walls, security cameras on every corner, a gate that required 3 clearance steps and communicated in no uncertain terms that the people inside were worth protecting from the world outside. Siwon's house simply existed. Clean lines, natural stone, a structure that sat in its neighborhood in Maplegu the way old money sits in a room, without needing to perform its weight for anyone. Jihoon registered all of this through the soles of his feet and the temperature of the air as he was brought inside. No performance. No ceremony of arrival. 2 staff members whose footsteps were soft and professional moved around him with a practiced efficiency that made no fuss over his condition, no careful steering, no treating him like a thing that might fall over if addressed directly. One of them, a woman whose voice carried the particular cadence of someone who had worked for powerful men long enough to have stopped being impressed by them, showed him to a room with warm floorboards and a window he could hear rain against. She left without explanation. He did not need one. What happened next was the thing that lodged somewhere under Jihoon's ribs and stayed there. When Siwon returned, he set something down on the table beside Jihoon without a word, a single folded sheet of paper, slightly raised on one side. Jihoon ran his fingertips across it, and his breath stopped. It was a floor plan. Every doorway marked in raised line, every staircase indicated, every room labeled in small neat embossed letters. The entire house. Complete. Nobody had ever done that without being asked. In 5 years of living in the Kong estate, no one had ever handed him a map. At the first meal, Siwon sat across from him and said nothing for the duration of it, no small talk, no filling the silence with noise that Jihoon did not need. And when the tea came, without Jihoon reaching or searching or going through the small performance of locating it on an unfamiliar table, the glass was simply already there. Placed precisely within reach. Not centered. Not where convention said to put it. Where Jihoon's hand would naturally fall. Jihoon sat with that small, exact gesture for the rest of the meal and tried to understand why it felt like more than anything larger had managed to in years. Across the city, in a room that still held the shape of the man who had left it, Kang Ryan was not sitting. He was standing at the center of the estate's main hall with his phone in his hand and his security director in front of him, and the look on his face was one that his staff had only seen twice before, both times directly preceding events that Seoul's underworld took months to recover from. He said Jihoon's name once, quietly, in a way that made every person in the room understand exactly what the coming hours were going to look like. The search began. Back in Maepugoo, Jihoon traced the raised lines of his floor plan one more time with his fingertips. He memorized the shape of it, not because he needed to, but because the act of being given it felt like something that deserved to be kept. For the first time in years, he felt like a person inside a house. Not a treasure inside a vault. He did not know yet that the map was only the beginning of what Park Siwon had prepared. And he did not know that 30 minutes away, 3 men who loved him were already moving in his direction. On the third morning, Jihoon came downstairs earlier than expected and found Siwon already at the table. This was not unusual. What was unusual was the paper spread across the table in front of him, pages of it, covered in handwriting, and the way Siwon's hands were moving. Slowly. Deliberately. Forming shapes in the air above the paper, checking them against what was written, adjusting, trying again. Jihoon stood in the doorway and understood immediately what he was looking at. Siwon was practicing his hand signs. Not a simplified version. Not the basic vocabulary of someone learning just enough to be polite. He was working through the extended grammar, the compound signs, the directional markers, the physical syntax that most people who attempted Jihoon's communication system gave up on within a week because it required genuine commitment to learn. The handwritten pages were a self-made reference guide. He had written it himself, from scratch, without being asked, without mentioning it, without making it into anything that required acknowledgement. Jihoon stood in the doorway for a moment longer than he needed to. Then he walked to the table and sat across from Siwon, who looked up and signed, imperfectly but completely legibly, "Good morning." "Did you sleep?" Jihoon signed back. "Better than I expected." Then, after a pause, "How long have you been working on this?" Siwon's mouth curved. "Since the bridge." 3 days. He had been learning for 3 days, in silence, without telling Jihoon it was happening. What followed was the first real conversation Jihoon had conducted at full capacity in longer than he could measure. Not the careful, abbreviated exchanges he had been limited to with the Kangs, where every communication required translation and simplification and the constant awareness that the other person was working to understand him and growing tired of the effort. Siwon was not tired. Siwon pushed back. He challenged arguments, misread signs deliberately to provoke clarification, laughed when Jihoon corrected him with a precision that apparently amused him. For an hour, through written notes and imperfect signs and the particular language two sharp minds construct between themselves when they stop performing, Jihoon remembered what it felt like to be fully met. In the afternoon, Siwon took him to a wide, empty room on the ground floor and told him, through a combination of signs and written notes, that they were going to work on something. He did not use the word training. He did not frame it as help. He stood in the center of the room and described the space in precise terms, placed Jihoon's hands on his own forearms to demonstrate weight distribution, and began teaching him to move through a physical confrontation without sight as though this was simply a thing two people did on a Wednesday. Not pity. Not compensation. Respect. The session ran long. Near the end of it, Siwon moved behind Jihoon to correct a defensive stance, and his hands came to rest on Jihoon's arms, and then went still. Jihoon went still too. The room held them both in a silence that was not empty. It was full of something that neither of them moved to address, and after a moment Siwon stepped back and the session ended without comment. At dinner, He slid a folded note across the table. Jihoon opened it. I knew you before the accident. You don't remember me. But I remember everything. Jihoon held the paper between his fingers for a long time. The texture of it. The slight pressure of the pen strokes beneath his fingertips. The weight of 7 words that rearranged the last 5 years of his life into a shape he did not yet have a name for. He sat with that note until the candle on the table burned low. And the question that rose in him was not "Who are you?" because something in him already knew the answer. The question was, "What did you see that night that you have never told me?" Siwon put the paper down on the table between them and did not pick it up again. Jihoon had been holding the note for 3 minutes. Siwon had counted. He watched Jihoon's fingers move across the words, not reading, exactly, but feeling the weight of them through the paper itself, the way he processed everything that mattered. The candle between them had burned down to a shorter version of itself. Outside, Seoul moved through its late-night rhythms, indifferent to what was happening inside this room. Then Jihoon set the note down, picked up his pen, and wrote. Tell me what you know. So Siwon told him. Not everything. Not yet. But the shape of it, the outline of a life that had existed before the darkness, before the silence, before the Khan estate and the white silk gloves and the role of a kept omega that the world had decided fit him so neatly. He told Jihoon that before the accident he had been sharp in a way that frightened people who worked alongside him. That he had moved through rooms and read intentions and extracted information with a precision that his handlers had described, in internal reports Siwon had once intercepted, as unerringly gifted. That the organization that raised them both had considered Kang Jihoon one of its finest assets. He told him the explosion was not an accident. That the Kang triplets had not caused it. That the guilt they carried, the guilt that drove 5 years of secret Thursday surgeries and desperate whispered conversations outside locked doors, was real and human and entirely misplaced. Jihoon sat with all of this without moving. His breathing stayed even. His hands were still on the table. This, Siwon had learned, was what composure looked like on a person who had rebuilt it from nothing, not the absence of feeling, but the decision about where to put it. Then Jihoon picked up his pen. Then why did you stay silent for years? Siwon looked at the question for a long moment. Then he answered it honestly, the way he had made a decision to answer everything, because dishonesty in this particular room felt like a thing that would cost him something he could not afford to lose. Because you were safe. And safe was the only thing I could give you. The silence after that was different from the ones before it. Jihoon set his pen down. He reached across the table, not for the notepad, not for the tea, and pressed 2 fingers against the inside of Siwon's wrist. Lightly. Precisely. Finding the pulse point with the accuracy of someone who had spent years learning to read the world through touch. Siwon did not move. Jihoon held his fingers there for 10 seconds. Measuring. Confirming something. His expression did not change, but something in the set of his shoulders did, a small, internal shift, like a door easing open on a hinge it had been testing for a while. Then one of Siwon's security staff appeared in the doorway. He spoke 1 sentence. A black vehicle had been spotted on the perimeter road, not breaching, not threatening, just present. Positioned. Watching. The Kang triplets had found him faster than either of them expected. Jihoon did not remove his fingers from Siwon's wrist. The question was no longer whether they were coming. It was whether Jihoon wanted to be found. What do you want to do? Siwon asked. Jihoon was quiet for a long moment. Then he signed 2 words. Simple. Clear. Not yet. The triplets did not come through the door. Siwon had half expected Ryan to try. The man's particular brand of obsession did not tend toward patience, and 5 years of protective fixation on Jihoon had given it a focus that most people never developed for anything. But the vehicle stayed on the perimeter road. It did not advance. Which meant Ryan was holding himself back, and that required more control than Siwon had credited him with, and that was, in its own way, more dangerous. He told Jihoon this at the table the next morning, through written notes, over tea that had gone slightly cold because neither of them had remembered to drink it. Jihoon read the note and wrote back. "They're waiting for me to come out." "Yes. They think I will." Siwon looked at him. "You might." Jihoon's pen moved again, slower this time. "You said you know who gave the order?" "The one for my life." "You didn't answer." The room went quiet in a specific way. Siwon set his cup down. He had been carrying this particular truth the way you carry something sharp in a pocket, carefully, always aware of it, always aware of what it would do if it shifted wrong. He had told himself there was a right time. He had told himself Jihoon needed to be ready. He understood now that those were things he had told himself because he was afraid, and that Jihoon had earned better than that. "I am not a good person," Siwon said. "But I am honest." He told him. He told him about the order, and who carried his name on it, and the fact that he had refused it. He told him without softening the parts that made him look like what he was, a man who had operated in the same darkness as everyone else in this story, who had done things he could not unmake, who had drawn a single line in a single moment, and chosen to stand on the right side of it for reasons that had nothing to do with virtue, and everything to do with a specific person he had been unable to stop thinking about since the first time he watched him work. He told Jihoon all of it. Flat and direct, the way you tell the truth when you have decided the relationship is worth the risk of it. Jihoon listened without interrupting. His hands were folded on the table in front of him, perfectly still, and his face was the face of a man receiving information and filing it, not the face of a man falling apart. When Siwon finished, Jihoon sat in the silence for a moment that stretched long enough to be uncomfortable. Then he wrote, "Did you know who gave that order?" Siwon's silence answered before he did. The knock at the door came from inside the house, not an intrusion, a notification. The perimeter team. The Kong vehicle had moved. Ryan had made a decision. Siwon rose from the table, and something in the set of his body shifted in the particular way it shifted when he was about to go deal with something that required the version of himself he kept separate from this room. A hand caught his sleeve. Firm. Sure. Not a plea, a choice. Jihoon held on. He did not sign anything. He did not write anything. He simply held onto Siwon's sleeve with his fingers and kept his face turned in Siwon's direction, and waited. Siwon looked at that hand on his arm for a long moment. Then he sat back down. He had spent years learning to read truth through the architecture of a situation, through angles and evidence, and the way people behaved under pressure. But the truth he was holding right now required none of that. Park Siwon's pulse under Jihoon's fingertips was the steadiest thing Jihoon had ever touched, and it told him everything the words had not quite reached. Jihoon made his choice. The message arrived at 4 a.m, and it did not come from any of the 3 Kong brothers. Siwon read it once, set his phone face down on the table, and sat very still for a moment in the way he sat still when he was deciding how to do something difficult. Then he picked up a notepad and wrote 4 words and handed it across the table to Jihoon, who had been awake and present because he had learned, in the years of living alongside powerful men, that 4 a.m. phone calls never contained good news. The 4 words were, "Your brother is moving." Jihoon's breathing changed. Not dramatically, a fraction of a degree, the kind of shift that most people would not notice. Siwon noticed. He told Jihoon what he had been piecing together for years, because the time for careful timing had passed. Shin Won-sok. Older by 4 years. Positioned higher inside the organization than anyone outside it understood, and consumed, since before the accident, by a specific fear that his younger brother was becoming something the organization valued more than him. That the gap between them was closing. That it would eventually close all the way and then reverse, and Won-sok would find himself standing in a shadow cast by someone who had once looked up to him. So he had arranged for the shadow to disappear. Not with a weapon. With a building. An explosion that looked like an accident, targeted precisely enough to remove Jihoon's sight and voice, the two instruments of his power, while leaving his body intact, because a dead Jihoon created questions. A damaged Jihoon created sympathy. Sympathy was easier to manage. The calm triplets had been in the building. They had survived. They had woken in the aftermath believing they had caused the explosion somehow, their presence, their negligence, their failure to protect. Won-sok had made sure that belief settled and calcified over time, feeding it through careful misdirection and the guilt that powerful men carry like a second spine. Their Thursday surgeries, their desperate secrecy, their 5 years of trying to restore what they believed they had broken, all of it had played out exactly as Won-sok had intended. They were occupied, distracted, and Jihoon was contained. But then Jihoon had run. And the surgeon the triplets had hired was closer to a breakthrough than Won-sok's timeline allowed for. Siwon passed Jihoon a second note. The surgical procedure was scheduled. The hospital, the room number, the time, all of it had already been arranged by the Khan triplets months ago, moving forward now without their knowledge that someone else had been watching the calendar. Won-sok had not tried to stop the surgery. He had simply arranged to be there when it ended. Jihoon held that note in both hands. His thumbs pressed flat against the paper. The candle on the table between them had gone out sometime in the previous hour, and neither of them had replaced it, and the room was lit only by the gray pre-dawn coming through the window. Siwon watched him and waited. Jihoon set the note down. He reached for the notepad and wrote one line. "I want the surgery." Siwon looked at those 4 words for a long moment. "I know," he said. "Can you keep me safe until it's done?" The answer did not require thought. "Yes." Jihoon nodded once. Then he folded his hands on the table and his face took on the particular stillness of a person who has made a decision and is now simply waiting for the world to catch up to it. The surgery was already scheduled. Won-sok had simply arranged to be there first. What he had not arranged for was Jihoon already knowing. Light came back in pieces, the way memory does, not all at once, not cleanly, but in fragments that arrived without warning and rearranged everything they touched. First there was white. Then edges. Then the particular quality of artificial brightness that belongs to hospital ceilings, which Jihoon had last seen from a different bed in a different lifetime, and which he now stared up at with eyes that were learning, again, how to process a world they had been locked out of for 5 years. Color came next. The pale mint of the ceiling. The dark frame of the window. The shape of a figure standing at the foot of the bed. His vision was imperfect, soft at the edges, slightly blurred, the way things look when they are real rather than remembered, but it was enough to resolve the figure into a face. Not Siwon's face. Not Ryan's or Seojin's or Daehoon's. A face he knew by a different method entirely, by voice, by the particular cadence of footsteps, by the way a room's temperature changed when its owner entered it. Shin Won-sok stood at the foot of the bed in a gray suit, and he was smiling. The smile was soft and careful and constructed with the precision of a man who had been practicing it. But Jihoon could hear his heartbeat from across the room. He had always been able to hear Won-sok's heartbeat. It ran fast and uneven in the specific pattern of a person performing calm they do not feel. "You should have stayed blind," Won-sok said. His voice was gentle, almost kind. "Now you'll watch everyone you love die." Jihoon held his brother's gaze and said nothing. He was cataloguing the room, the exits, the sounds coming from beyond the door, footsteps in the corridor, more than one set, moving with the controlled urgency of people who knew exactly where they were going and had agreed to arrive at the same time. The door opened. Park Siwon came through it first, and behind him, with the strange terrible symmetry of a story closing its own circle, came the Kang triplets. All 3. Ryan's eyes went immediately to Jihoon and then to Won-sok, and the look that crossed his face was the look of a man who had just understood something that had been wrong for 5 years. Seojun stopped in the doorway. Daehoon, for the first time since Jihoon had known him, was completely still. They all looked at Won-sok. Then they all looked at Jihoon. Siwon crossed the room in 4 steps and placed himself between Jihoon and Won-sok with the matter-of-fact efficiency of a man fulfilling a very old promise. He did not touch Jihoon. He did not need to. He simply stood there, and the room reorganized itself around that fact. Won-sok's smile held for 1 more second. Then it didn't. Jihoon's throat was raw from the surgery. His voice, when it came, was barely a voice at all. It was a thin, fragile thing that had not been used in 5 years, scraping its way back into existence with the particular roughness of something reclaiming territory. But it was there. He did not say Won-sok's name. He did not say Siwon's. He turned his face toward the corridor beyond the door, toward the 3 men standing in it, and he said the only name that mattered. Somewhere outside the room, he heard footsteps change direction. The tribunal took place 3 weeks later in a building that had no public address, before 7 people whose names did not appear in any record Jihoon had ever been allowed to access. He sat at a long table and he spoke. For 4 hours, in a voice still rough at the edges but growing steadier with use, he delivered the testimony that dismantled 5 years of constructed silence. He told them about the Thursday nights and what he had found at the end of them. He told them about the bridge and about Park Siwon's hands in the rain. He told them about the order that had carried his name, and the man who had given it, and the 5 years of guilt that 3 brothers had carried for a fire they had not lit. And then he told them the part that had come back to him in the hospital, not gradually, not in fragments, but all at once, the way a room looks when you open a door, the full memory of a Tuesday in March, and a corridor in the Kong estate, and a conversation he had overheard between 2 organization operatives discussing a plan to eliminate everyone in a specific building that night. The Kong triplets. Park Siwon. An operation that would end 3 problems in 1 clean event. Jihoon had made a decision in under 60 seconds. He had detonated the building himself. He had gotten everyone out first, or tried to. The blast had been larger than his calculation. He had been the one closest to the center of it. He had woken 3 weeks later in the dark and the silence, and spent 5 years believing he had survived something done to him, when the truth was that he had survived something he had done for everyone else. No one in the room spoke for a long time after he finished. Won-sok's case closed before the month ended. Ryan did not fight the outcome. Seo-jun left Seoul on a Tuesday, which Jihoon learned secondhand, and the only message he sent was 4 characters in a text to a number Jihoon had not known he still had. "I'm glad you're okay." Jihoon sent nothing. Sometimes the people who talk the most have the least to say when the time for it arrives. 1 year later, the studio occupied the top floor of a building overlooking the Han River. Jihoon had chosen the location himself. He had stood at the window on the viewing visit and felt the particular quality of light that came off the water in the late afternoon, warm, diffuse, moving, and understood that he wanted to spend time with it. He had not painted in years. His hands remembered the motion before his mind caught up, which was, he had decided, the most honest form of memory. He was working on a canvas the morning Siwon came in without knocking, the way he always came in now. He did not announce himself. He moved through the room with the same even weight as always, the footstep pattern Jihoon had catalogued years before he had a face to attach it to, and set 2 cups of tea on the side table. One precisely within reach. Jihoon did not turn from the canvas. He reached out without looking and found the cup exactly where it was, because it was always exactly where it was, because this was one of the fixed things now, one of the constants he had built his new world around. He curled his fingers around the warmth of it, and kept painting. Siwon sat in the chair by the window. He looked out at the river. After a while he said quietly, "What are you painting?" Jihoon considered the canvas. Then he signed with one hand, not bothering to put the brush down. "A bridge," he signed. "At night. In the rain." Siwon was quiet for a moment. Then, "Is there anyone on it?" Jihoon added one more stroke to the canvas. "2 people." he signed. One of them is sitting down. And the other one? Jihoon set his brush down and turned to look at Siwon for the first time since he had come in. The afternoon light from the river was coming through the window behind him, catching the line of his jaw, the particular composed stillness that Jihoon had once read only through sound and heartbeat and the temperature of a room, and could now finally, fully, completely see. The other one, Jihoon said aloud, in his own voice, which was no longer rough and was no longer fragile, is staying. If this story found something real in you, if it reached a place you weren't expecting, then you already know what to do with that feeling. Drop it in the comments. Tell us what you felt, what you want to say, what part of this stayed with you. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss the next story on this channel, because there are more coming and they were made for exactly the kind of person who stayed until the end of this one. Share this with someone who needs to hear it, someone who needs to be reminded that the love that survives everything is the kind built on truth. We will see you in the next story. It is already waiting.